Thank you for coming back to watch part 3 of the Eastport Tower video. When we left off at the end of part 2, all of the ballast, the rocks for the mainline track and some of the weeds and a little bit of scenery along the edges had been put in place, as had been the New Haven Railroad Pagoda Roof Tower, the interlocking tower that controlled the switches. Now it was time to start putting in some scenery along the edges of the main line, and I glued some pieces of cardboard randomly down to create some lumps. You don't want this to look like a pool table absolutely flat because it's quite rare in the real world. I used some strips of 3M double stick tape that would hold down the felt that I would then put in place, as you see here, and then it would be sort of make a transition using only semi-sticky painter's tape to get it down to the level of the wood of the board. Moving to the front of the table, doing much the same, but I decided to introduce something that I had spotted in my neighborhood that you probably can find in your town if there's railroad tracks from some old industries or a freight house as we have here. And that is a buried track. You see the rail that's all rusted out, and on the left, the right-hand rail is barely showing here. On the right is where the loading dock was for the freight house. It's all still there, but the track was severed from the main line decades ago. And I thought that might be an interesting little bit of history to put along my fictitious location here. So I have put down some felt, not glued down yet, but marked as to where it'll be cut so as not to interfere with the ballast or any other scenic elements that are already there. I put the track in just to trace both the outside of it and the inside of the rails for the felt pieces, which I'll need to cover all of this. There it is, all marked, so I'll cut that away to put the track in, and then the inner part there I'll need to cut to put inside between the rails. Elmer's glue worked great to hold the plastic track ties down to the cardboard, and once it was in place, I tacked it down overnight. And while that was starting drying, I got out this really handy 3M double stick tape and put down to hold the felt eventually in place. On each side of the track I put a long strip of that tape, and down the middle too. So at this point, nothing more I could do with this. I think I was done for the day. Next day that I came back to work on the layout, I peeled away the tape and actually held on to some of that backing paper for a project I'll show you in a few minutes. So now I have glued down the felt to underlay whatever other scenic materials I use. Outside there, it's actually touching the rails. And you'll see the right-hand rail has been painted brown to simulate rust with a paint marker. Now both rails have been, and I've also glued in place the middle part between the rails. This is just to make it as weed-grown and abandoned and neglected looking as possible. Now I pulled out my box full of all these bags of various scenery powders, coarse, fine, medium, different colors, and this is my first attempt ever at scenery. There's the first layer pulled out. This is a bag that cost me $0.25 that I got at a train show. All this stuff, you can always fix a mistake. You can always tear out stuff, add stuff on, and glue it with the spray adhesive. And I found that once I had gotten the more coarser, brightly colored vegetation, it was really starting to look like somewhat like I had envisioned. And there you can see the rails for the abandoned freight house track. What was there once upon a time, we'll never know. You see on the left-hand side there some rocks, rock outcroppings, or actually those are rocks from the backyard. And to my disbelief, never having done scenery before, this came out looking pretty decent, enough to be going on with. So I was really happy about that. And now it was going to be on to some other projects. You'll probably recall from an earlier segment of this video that the layout was built in 6 pieces, big pieces that could be pulled apart if we had to move to another house. And that requires that you have floating tracks. You can see where the seam is right there, all the blue tape and the crack in the wood there. These are floating tracks that had shipping tape placed on the back and some ballast squeezed down between the ties and a little bit of adhesive put on there so that those can lift out. They're never going to stick to the roadbed. There's some wires, some feeder wires that'll have to be covered. Now you see the seam in between the pieces of tape. That's right where the seam is between the two tables. There was one little problem here due to the spacing of these catenary masts that hold the overhead wire up. One of them was right on the seam, so I had to do a little extra attention to put that in place with a better, little bit longer screw, and then will have to be covered up with scenic materials. Now that everything's ready, I covered with painter's tape the stuff that had already been sprayed with adhesive. And that way, none of the stuff I was putting down in terms of ballast and all that was going to gunk up what I already had done. So now, as before, we use the scenic cement, kind of a weak glue solution. There it is, sprayed on. You can see where it's darker than the rest of the ballast. That's where those floating tracks are. There was one little bit of housekeeping to do here, which was that catenary mast I had to put in. A little bit more ballast there. And there it is, still drying, but once it dried, it looked pretty close to the rest of the entire main line, so I was happy to see that. Being a devoted fan of the New Haven Railroad, this artifact is one of my most precious possessions. It's the 2 by 3 foot heavy sheet metal, more than a century old sign warning people not to climb on the vertical catenary iron masts that held the bridges up. I made a photo of that. I reduced it to tiny size, printed a bunch of them on paper, cut those into pieces, put those onto the one side of the double stick tape. You can see one trimmed there to resemble pretty closely. That I had to trim them all one by one and then put them onto some of this backing paper that I mentioned a few minutes ago. And this was the most fun. I'd envisioned this for a long time, to actually go all the way down the main line, putting on these signs pretty much the way that they looked back in the day. And to my amazement, running a train past this scene now where the tower is, with some scenery in place, a few details yet to be added. I was doing scenery, and I never felt confident enough to try that before. One detail I had looked forward to adding was switch machines, pretty close to what they look like in real life. They don't operate, they're just little scenic details. Another thing I wanted to have was a depot, and using this model, which would end up looking completely different in terms of coloration than the model in the box, I took the exterior panels, sprayed them white, which was to give color for the grout between the bricks, and then I did a little tiny test spot with some steel wool right there on the top to see if I could get the red brick pieces to shine through, and they do pretty well. So I did that on all the exterior pieces, and here was the depot in place with a little concrete, quasi-concrete platform addition right along the main line there. I used some gray chalk to make the roof look weathered, and what a beautiful sight on a gently curving main line with catenary over it, and a passenger train with long cars going by the depot. I like it. So now it was time at last to turn to the neglected upper level, with most of the mainline lower level stuff in place. The original track plan, if you look at the bottom, it shows your 4 mainline tracks. The little X there is the tower, which ended up being moved a little bit to the left. Behind it, on the upper level in front of that backdrop, were freight tracks I hadn't really figured out. But then as the plan evolved, I thought at one point to have, you can see this curving sort of lower grade freight diesel main line just kind of wandering over the terrain in the upper level. And as you can see there too, by the way, that bridge over the main line did survive into the final plan, but it goes into the backdrop, so I would have had 2 levels of tracks going through tunnels into the backdrop, and then this upper level on stilts would have had to go all the way around behind, and that just was not going to work. So instead, revised that a little bit so that everything on the upper level was going to be in front of the backdrop. Behind this tunnel portal you see here, there would be a hill, and that would be something to hide a short stub-ended freight storage track so that you could store a local freight with a few cars and an engine and a caboose, come out and service the industries will be down that end. Right about here where the train is, those would be probably just some storage tracks for cars. And then as we get over into the right hand end, these are storage tracks for coal hoppers for the power plant that's going to go there. Now we're down the far end of the table. This was the freight house. It's now in a little bit different spot, but I had made a sort of little custom sign to go on that for New Haven Railroad, town of Eastport. And this is coming toward the near end of the layout. Now see, right there is a seam in the table, as I said earlier on in another part of the video. This is built in 6 chunks, and there too you needed floating tracks to be able to disassemble this without causing a disaster. And here's a view from the end of the right hand side. Now look down in there, which is going to be covered by scenery. There's hidden tracks. Those are those 2 big storage loops for long freight trains. That's going to be covered over. And just to the right of this is where the power plant will go, and you can see there's maybe a marking or something. Yeah, for a coal dumper building I would have to scratch build to be elevated a little bit above the level of the power plant, presumably connected to it by some underground conveyor. So this is built partly here to distract a little from the main line disappearing into a tunnel, and we're beginning to get a scene here with the depot and the power plant and so forth. A lot of scenery to do yet. If you ever look at a mainline track, you'll notice that the tops, only the tops, are polished by the wheels of freight trains that go by often. The sides of the rails are dark brown from corrosion and dirt and so forth. So to simulate that, it's very tedious to do, but the results are nice. I went down this whole 20 feet of freight tracks that I'd put in on the upper level, painted everything, even though the ties are pretty much going to be hidden by all the weeds and everything. And then once that had dried, I used an abrasive track cleaner to clean off the rail tops, not only so they look shiny, but so they'll conduct some electricity. And there's the effect in front of the power plant with those rails. Again, those will be mostly hidden. I made an incredible discovery out walking one night by a hardware store that was moving, and they threw out on their front lawn these pegboard things that were perfect for the backdrop that I had envisioned. So that was a lucky find. I threw them in the car immediately, and they have worked out great. They'll eventually be covered with sky, clouds, whatever. If you go to www.substack.com, use the word Eastport as a search term, and you will find the Eastport Tower blog that is the written version that goes along with this. So I appreciate very much that you've come along to look at another segment of this, and there is another on the way. Thank you.